Chapter 8:15. An enormous explosion resounded as energy ripples spread out. It was enough to cause many 5th and 6th level Heavenly Palace experts to feel quite a bit of pressure. Such a huge commotion naturally attracted the attention of the disciples from the 3 factions. Facing such a scene, even the expressions of the disciples from the Cloud Sky faction changed. They only felt that Yan Chutian was definitely in danger. If the disciples from the Cloud Sky faction were like this, one could imagine how the disciples from the Tianyang faction and the Kongtong faction would be like. It was because of this that the woman in the black dress sneered and looked at Ba Hong with a gaze full of ridicule. Just like the woman in black, the disciple from the Kongtong faction who was fighting with Maihani also coldly smiled at this moment. As expected, at this moment, Maihani was indeed staring at the source of the violent explosion. At this moment, even her delicate body revealed a trace of trembling. But just as he was about to make a move, he didn't expect that within the explosion, an unexpected soft voice that could be said to make everyone feel disbelief would suddenly and slowly spread out. It was also this soft voice that immediately caused Fan Chuan's face to stiffen as his eyes stared at the source of the explosion. "Ha, to be so complacent now, isn't it too early to be happy?" The atmosphere between heaven and earth seemed to have frozen at this moment. Only the ripples and rumbles caused by the explosion gradually calmed down. But when the two truly calmed down, the atmosphere between heaven and earth suddenly became incomparably tense, because they could clearly see that Yan Chutian was standing in the air, completely unharmed, as if the violent explosion from before didn't cause the slightest damage to him. Of course, it couldn't cause any damage. At the last moment of the explosion, he had already used the mysterious Sun Devour, and although Fan Chuan's method wasn't weak, it still didn't exceed the limit of the mysterious Sun Devour. How is this possible? The final situation in front of them caused the expression of the woman in black who was still mocking to change. Ba Hong, who seemed a little strange just now, let out a soft sigh of relief at this moment. Then he slowly said, "It seems that the result today is on the side of my Cloud Sky." Many of the surrounding disciples were shocked. However, the one who found this the most unbelievable was naturally Fan Chui himself. He could even accept the fact that his opponent was struggling at death's door under his mysterious spirit, Swordbreaker. But now, the other party clearly looked unscathed. How was this possible? At the same time, Yan Chutian would not hesitate to block the attack, because this was the perfect opportunity for him to make a move. Thus, in the next instant, his figure could clearly be seen disappearing from the spot like a ghost. When he reappeared, he was already behind Fan Chui. At the same time, spiritual light began to gather in his palm. It was the 5 elements fragmentary star mark. However, since Fan Chui was able to step into the Tianfujing 6th floor, even if his opponent seized the opportunity, he quickly reacted. Immediately after, the spiritual energy around him surged wildly and condensed into a thick spiritual energy barrier. In this way, even though Yan Chutian's 5 elements fragmentary star mark was forcefully descending, it was still blocked by the spiritual energy barrier. Then, even though the spiritual energy barrier was hurriedly deployed, it barely managed to block Yan Chutian's Berserk 5 origin fragmentary star mark. Although this scene made many of the Cloud Sky disciples feel that it was a pity, they also knew that there was nothing they could do about it. After all, Fan Chui's cultivation base was at the Tianfujing 6th floor. Even if he had just entered, his foundation was extremely deep. He had a foundation of at least 6,000 feet. Thus, it was too difficult for a Tianfujing 4th floor cultivator to rely on an opportunity to defeat him in one strike. However, even so, the gazes of the Cloud Sky disciples were filled with respect for Yan Chuan. This was because a Tianfujing 4th floor cultivator was actually able to force a Tianfujing 6th floor cultivator to such an extent. There was probably no one else in the entire firmament God Palace who could do such a thing. However, This couldn't help but make everyone worried. From their point of view, if Fan Shui was able to struggle free from this difficult situation, then Yan Chutian would definitely be in a difficult situation. After all, after this scene, Fan Shui would definitely not underestimate him in the slightest. At that time, the difference in cultivation between the two would become even more obvious. Not only did the crowd think of this point, but Fan Shui himself also immediately thought of this point. Thus, he quickly calmed his expression. As long as he could endure this moment, then it would be his opponent's time of death. As long as he used his full strength, his opponent would not be as lucky as he was now. He would definitely let him know the price of daring to scheme against him. However, as he thought of this, when Fan Shui's gaze inadvertently landed on Yan Chutian's face, he couldn't help but tremble, because he saw that there was still a trace of mockery on his opponent's face. In his view, this trace of mockery seemed to be mocking him for being able to endure this moment. The trace of mockery on Yan Chutian's face didn't have much deeper meaning. However, it would be extremely foolish to think that there would be a next moment under such circumstances. He had accumulated the power of the profound Sun Devourer for so long, but he had never used it before. With this thought in mind, one could imagine what Yan Chutian would do next. Without any explanation, he formed a seal and slowly reversed the profound Sun Devourer, forming a profound Sun Devourer that seemed to be able to return all the power of the profound Sun Devourer. Profound Sun Devourer! As the soft shout sounded, an extremely vast and turbulent accumulated power surged out in front of Yan Chutian like a volcanic eruption. In the face of such a devastating power, even Fan Shui found it difficult to think of anything. The surging power that was spat out tore through all his defenses and tore apart the nameplate at the first moment. He only had time to vaguely sense that this enormous power seemed to be mixed with the power of his profound spirit Jian. In the blink of an eye, only a collapsed space was left at the spot where Fan Gui had been. Needless to say, this scene made those disciples of the Cloud Heaven lineage who were preparing to worry for Yan Chutian dumbstruck. It also caused the disciples from the Tianyang and Kongtong factions, who were waiting for Fan Shui to retaliate, to become deathly silent at this moment. There was not the slightest bit of noise. This was because they never expected that a moment ago it could be said that Fan Shui's chances of victory were extremely high. However, in the next instant, an indescribable, enormous power suddenly erupted. Fan Shui didn't even have time to cry out miserably or react before he was directly eliminated. How could anyone accept this in such a short time? Looking at the slowly recovering collapsed space, Yan Chutian finally let out a sigh of relief. It was true that the accumulated power of the profound Sun Devourer was strong. However, it was also thanks to Fan Shui's carelessness, or it could be said that he had succeeded in showing weakness earlier. Just as Yan Chutian let out a sigh of relief, he suddenly heard a miserable cry from another place. He looked over and saw that the current Maihani had slashed at the body of the Tianfujing sixth-floor cultivator, who was fiercely fighting with her. Although there was the protection of the nameplate, it could clearly be seen that this sword had already seen red and caused the cultivator to suffer quite a bit of injury. However, more importantly, although there was the protection of the nameplate, this meant that he had already been eliminated. Sure enough, the next cultivator who let out a miserable cry was wrapped up by the power of space and was directly teleported away. Looking at this scene and Maihani's extremely cold expression, Yan Chutian secretly swallowed a mouthful of saliva. In his heart, he thought that women were indeed creatures that should not be provoked. At the same time, as if she had felt Yan Chutian's gaze, Maihani's beautiful eyes slowly looked over. The frosty expression on her pretty face immediately disappeared. Immediately after, a crimson red and impatience appeared on her white cheeks, as if she wanted to explain why she was so fierce just now. However, when her red lips opened, Maihani was stunned and couldn't say anything. She could only stare at Yan Chutian with a slightly red face. At the same time, with Yen Chutian and Maihani as the starting point on the various battlefields, the disciples of the Cloud Sky faction continued to crush them. As more and more disciples of the Tianyang and Kongtong factions were eliminated, the woman in the black dress and the male cultivators of the Tianfujing 7th floor had no choice but to give the order to retreat. Otherwise, if they continued to force themselves like this, they would probably cause this group of disciples that were temporarily separated to be completely eliminated in an extremely short period of time. Chapter 8:16. With Yen Chutian and Maihani as the starting point, more and more disciples from the Cloud Sky faction gathered their strength to suppress the other party. As a result, the woman in black and the male cultivator from the Tianfujing 7th floor had no choice but to lead the disciples under them to retreat again and again. This was not because they were afraid, but because they truly did not dare to not retreat. Otherwise, if this continued, even they did not dare to guarantee that their temporary group of disciples would not be completely eliminated. However, their retreat clearly caused the expressions of Shen Wuling, Wang Han, and the others, who were also gathering their strength to attack, to become extremely ugly. This was because they never would have thought that while they were unable to make any progress, the group of disciples they had split off would be beaten to such a sorry state, and had no choice but to retreat. Damn it! Such a situation caused the two people, who were in high spirits and extremely calm before, to have distorted expressions of anger on their faces. They could not help but curse in a low voice. When they looked at Yuan Yang and Ba Hong, who were leading the group over, their eyes were filled with dense anger. However, they were also decisive, even though the situation in front of them made them feel extremely angry. However, they clearly understood that if this stalemate continued, the situation would only become more and more disadvantageous to them. After all, if this stalemate continued, they would have to bear the risk of being attacked from both sides. Thus, after exchanging a glance, the two of them practically spoke at the same time, ordering their disciples to retreat. Under the orders of the two of them, the groups of disciples under them retreated extremely decisively. However, this was actually because these disciples already knew that the situation in front of them was not good. After a dozen breaths, the groups of disciples from the Tianyang and Kongtong factions, who were originally in a stalemate at the center of the valley, withdrew and stopped at the edge of the valley. Without their encirclement, the Cloud Sky faction and Xianling faction disciples who were originally trapped in the valley were naturally able to directly escape and appear in the sky. When they finally managed to escape, without any words, they already understood everything when they saw the large group of disciples led by Yuan Yang and Ba Hong. It was also at this moment that many of the profound Spirit faction's disciples, who had previously vented their anger on the Cloud Sky faction's disciples, lowered their heads in shame. They weren't idiots, so it was naturally impossible for them to be unable to discern exactly who it was that allowed them to escape from this mountain valley. This person was none other than the Yun Tian lineage who had vented their anger on them earlier. Hence, how could they remain calm after escaping? More or less, shame appeared on their faces. However, they quickly turned this shame into strength and transferred it to the disciples of the Tianyang and Kongtong factions. It was precisely the disciples of these two factions that had caused them to fall into such a difficult situation. Now that the situation had been reversed, it was only natural that they would not let the disciples of those two factions off so easily. He seemed to have sensed the other party's covetous gaze. Many of the disciples of the Tianyang and Kongtong factions had a bad feeling on their faces. This was because even though the top geniuses of their two factions and the quality of their disciples were not inferior to the other parties, they were still in the same cultivation realm. However, in terms of numbers, there was already a large gap. After all, they were only formed by a group of disciples from the Tianyang and Kongtong factions. However, the other party was formed by a group of disciples from the Profound Spirit faction and two groups of disciples from the Cloud Sky faction. Thus, if they were to truly engage in a chaotic battle, even if the disciples at the top would not be afraid, The disciples at the bottom would very likely not be able to withstand the other party's attacks and would be defeated. However, such a great opportunity had ended in failure after spending quite a bit of time. Not to mention the ordinary disciples. Even people like Shen Wuling and Wang Han would not be able to easily accept it. Even at this moment, the gazes with which Shen Wuling and Wang Han looked at Yuan Yang and Ba Hong were still filled with anger that could not be concealed. If it wasn't for the other party, they would have already stepped on the other party, unable to move. However, it was precisely because of their support that the originally advantageous situation had been destroyed, turning it into an extremely disadvantageous situation for their two factions. However, no matter how furious he was, his rationality told him that he absolutely could not continue fighting. Otherwise, the ones who would truly die here today would likely be the disciples of the Tianyang and Kongtong factions. However, before leaving, both Shen Wuling and Wang Han naturally did not forget to leave behind some ruthless words. Cloud Sky faction, Profound Spirit faction, you can consider yourselves lucky today to be able to snatch a chance of survival at such a crucial moment. However, just you wait. This Sky Desert battle has yet to end. As long as you wish to remain in this Sky Desert, you will definitely not be so lucky next time. The moment he finished speaking, Shen Wuling and Wang Han controlled their spiritual energy and flew towards the other parts of the floating mountain. Since the two of them had already taken the lead, the other disciples naturally followed. However, even though the two of them had spoken ruthlessly, their current appearance caused their own disciples to feel dejected in the eyes of the two of them. Seeing the disciples of the Tianyang and Kongtong factions leaving in an unconcealable manner, the disciples of the Cloud Sky faction and Profound Spirit faction all revealed expressions of excitement and complacency. This was especially true for the disciples of the two factions that were trapped earlier. They never would have imagined that the final result would be like this. After the disciples of the Tianyang and Kongtong factions left, the disciples of the Cloud Sky faction and Profound Spirit faction sat down cross-legged in the Mount Valley to recover from their injuries. At such a time, they were not worried that the disciples of the other factions would launch a sneak attack. After all, the three groups of disciples had already formed an extremely huge force when they met. If any faction wanted to launch a sneak attack on them now, they would first have to consider whether or not they possessed sufficient strength. Otherwise, they would definitely go for wool and come home shorn. At the same time, the disciples of the Tianyang and Kongtong factions that had already left the mountain valley had an unprecedentedly stifling atmosphere. Every single disciple's face was gloomy, and it was difficult for them to reveal the slightest trace of a smile. How could they accept that the originally favorable situation had turned into such an outcome? They could even imagine that if this matter were to spread, they would likely become the laughingstock of the disciples of the other factions. It would also be a disgrace to their two factions. However, apart from the gloomy expression on his face, Shen Wuling's face was also continuously accumulating coldness. Today, the other side had run into Dog's Hit Luck and had a reinforcement team arrive in time. However, there would definitely not be such luck next time. Furthermore, in terms of reinforcement teams, his Tianyang faction also had a reinforcement team that was rapidly rushing over from outside the floating mountain. At that time, he wanted to see if the Cloud Sky faction and Profound Spirit faction could still cause a storm in front of him. With that thought in mind, Shen Wuling's expression gradually improved. However, he also clearly understood that this matter would likely continue to become more and more popular in the following period of time. In the end, it was just as Shen Wuling had expected. Over the next few days, the matter gradually spread in the floating mountain through some unknown method, and the popularity of the matter continued to soar. No one would have thought that the sneak attack launched by the Tianyang and Kongtong factions would actually be countered, although this was because the other side had waited for reinforcements to arrive. They should have been fully prepared from the moment they launched their sneak attack. How could they allow such a flaw to appear? Thus, this matter ultimately became the laughingstock of many disciples from the various factions, ridiculing the Tianyang and Kongtong factions. On a certain high slope of the floating mountain, quite a number of figures were seated. Faintly at the center of them were a white, clothed figure and a blue, clothed figure. At this moment, there were traces of shock on the faces of the two people. This was because, from the news they had received, the Cloud Sky faction had actually managed to escape from the attack of the Tianyang and Kongtong factions. In the end, they had no choice but to force the disciples of the Tianyang and Kongtong factions to retreat. Although the white-clothed figure was also shocked by such news, he did not show much emotion. After all, regardless of whether it was the Tianyang Kongtong faction or the Cloud Sky faction, he did not feel anything. However, he did not show much emotion. Although the blue-clothed figure had an indifferent expression, the aura that he inadvertently emitted clearly announced the true emotions in his heart and was not what he showed on the surface. Chapter 8:17. Soon after, as if sensing the gaze of the white-clothed figure, although his expression was still calm, he still muttered to himself as if explaining himself. It seems that the Tianyang faction is truly not worthy of the position of the head of the 8 factions. They actually set up a trap first and still failed. As he slowly spoke, the blue-robed figure's expression became increasingly indifferent. However, at this moment, the white-clothed figure's expression had become increasingly mocking. Because he didn't say anything just now, no matter how one looked at it, the blue-robed figure's words seemed to be a confession without being pressed. However, while he was mocking, he didn't delve deeper into this matter and instead changed the topic. Although the Tianyang faction failed this time, it was only because they had the advantage of numbers. However, I have already received news that there seems to be a new group of Tianyang disciples rapidly heading towards the floating mountain. At that time, the situation will most likely tilt towards them. Hearing the white-clothed figure's words, the blue-robed figure's expression gradually became solemn because he had also heard of this point. However, he didn't panic. Due to the fact that the Celestial Array faction had always been neutral, very few disciples of the other factions would directly attack them. However, it might be a little different this time. After all, he had already said that this time he didn't just want the Celestial Array faction to remain neutral. His Celestial Array faction had been silent for a long time, and it was time for them to show their edge to the other factions. At the same time, the disciples of the Cloud Sky and Xianling factions who had been quietly sitting outside the valley for a long time gradually recovered. Since they had recovered, it was naturally time for the two factions to separate. After all, they weren't disciples of the same faction and naturally couldn't stay together forever. Otherwise, if they encountered a fortuitous encounter, how would they split it? Therefore, one could very quickly see the Xianling faction disciples under the lead of the 3 commander disciples of the Tianfujing 7th floor quickly flying towards other parts of the floating mountain. As for the 2 groups of the Cloud Sky faction, there was no need for them to separate. It could even be said that they absolutely couldn't separate. After all, the Cloud Sky faction had always been the weakest among the other factions. Only when the 2 groups met did they faintly become the overlord of the various factions on the floating mountain. But of course, everyone knew that this was only temporary. The reinforcements from the other factions could arrive at any time. At that time, the situation of his Cloud Sky faction would become extremely bad. But at the very least, he could buy some time. Taking advantage of this time gap, the Cloud Sky bloodline could plunder as many crystal essences as possible in the floating mountain range. Once the reinforcements from the various factions arrived, all they had to do was to be a little more stable. With this thought in mind, Yan Chutian and the other disciples of the Cloud Sky faction naturally couldn't remain in this mountain valley for too long. After they had rested for a while, they began to search the floating mountain range for crystal essence opportunities under the leadership of 4 commander-level disciples. The heavens rewarded those who persevered. Or it could be said that the crystal marrow opportunities in the floating mountain range were simply too abundant, allowing them to quickly obtain crystal marrow treasure lands one after another. The crystal marrow excavated from the crystal marrow treasure lands made even Yan Chutian's eyes light up. This was because it meant that he could polish the remaining 2,000 feet of his heavenly palace in an extremely short amount of time. He had even thoroughly studied the entire heavenly palace. After harvesting the crystal marrow, given Yan Chutian's character, he naturally wouldn't leave it behind. Instead, he immediately used it on his blade. Therefore, when night fell, one could see Yan Chutian sitting cross-legged somewhere in the crowd, quietly refining the crystal marrow he had obtained during the day and polishing his heavenly palace. 2 days later, he finished polishing the remaining 2,000 feet of his heavenly palace. Then he used the power of the crystal marrow to thoroughly study his 2,000 feet heavenly palace. Although he didn't need to go to great lengths to refine his heavenly palace after each breakthrough, he still needed to thoroughly study it. After all, every time he made a breakthrough, the crystal marrow, which had been polished to the extreme, would more or less become rough again. This didn't mean that its quality was weakened. Instead, it meant that the original quality level could no longer keep up with the new realm. The larger the area of the heavenly abode, the more time and price one would have to pay for the research. Perhaps some cultivators would consciously or subconsciously skip the step of thoroughly studying it because of some objective factors or the trouble involved. However, Yan Chutian would never do that. This was because he knew all too well that this step of thoroughly studying it was extremely important. It would also affect the size of his heavenly palace when he made a breakthrough. Therefore, Yan Chutian could be said to be extremely serious when it came to thoroughly studying it. He wasn't any less serious than when he was polishing his heavenly palace. In this way, the foundation of his heavenly palace would naturally not remain the same. Instead, it would slowly increase at an almost imperceptible speed. However, just as Yan Chutian felt that he was about to finish thoroughly studying his heavenly palace, a commotion suddenly broke out outside the crystal marrow treasure lands they currently occupied. Looking at it with the naked eye, one could clearly see that many figures had gathered outside the crystal marrow treasure lands. Judging from their attire, these figures seemed to be the disciples of the Tianyang branch. However, unlike before, although this was still the Tianyang branch's team, it was obviously a new team. This was because even the leading disciples were completely different. The 3 disciples of the Tianfujing's 7th floor leading the team were 2 women and 1 man. The 2 women looked extremely similar. Even the aura they exuded was almost identical. Needless to say, they were definitely a pair of sisters. As for the remaining man, he was dressed in black armor. His entire body exuded an extremely strong spiritual pressure that was enough to make any cultivator of the Tianfujing's 6th floor feel extremely oppressed. Although Yan Chutian didn't know about the 3 of them, he soon learned about their identities from Maihani. The sisters were called Lu Yenji and Lu Binghan. Although the 2 of them didn't have any backing, they were still able to reach their current positions step by step. One could only imagine how strong and talented they were. In addition, because the 2 of them were sisters, they also cultivated a set of joint attack spiritual techniques. Once this technique was used, it was extremely powerful. It was difficult for anyone in the same realm to match it. As for the black-armored man, his name was Feng Xiang. His cultivation had also truly stepped into the Tianfujing 7th floor. His spiritual technique, the Black Flame Demonic Spear, was extremely famous. It was said that the Black Flame Demonic Spear could not only corrode spiritual energy, but also many inexplicable mysterious powers. After hearing the characteristics of the Black Flame Demonic Spear, Yan Chutian was definitely interested in it. He also wanted to see if the Black Flame Demonic Spear, which could corrode many mysterious powers, could corrode his mysterious yang energy. Of course, although he wanted to know, he definitely wouldn't clash with it now. After all, the other party had the cultivation of the Tianfujing 7th floor. If he were to clash with it now, even if his mysterious yang energy didn't disappoint him, he wouldn't be able to withstand more than a few attacks from the other party. Returning to the main topic, when 2 branches met, there was no need to mention 2 branches that had a conflict with each other not long ago. Even if this Tianyang branch wasn't the same as the previous one, they wouldn't have any good feelings for each other. At this moment, the disciples of the Cloud Sky branch didn't need to be afraid. Although the other party wasn't weak, the disciples of the Cloud Sky branch were stronger. Although that was the case, no matter if it was Lu Yenji Lu Binghan or that Fang Xiang, their gazes were still filled with contempt. His gaze was still filled with disdain. Then he coldly sneered. "Ha! It seems that you're the ones who luckily escaped from my Tianyang branch. Although it was because of Shen Wuling's own incompetence, I still have to tell you that you won't have such luck in the future. In the end, the overlord of this sky desert and even the entire inner sect of the Firmament God Palace will be our Tianyang branch." After saying those words, the large group of disciples left like a tide under the lead of the 2 women and 1 man. The current situation was unfavorable to them, so they naturally wouldn't do anything. However, although the Tianyang branch's new group left, it caused quite a shock to the disciples of the Cloud Sky branch. Everyone knew that the arrival of the Tianyang branch's new group was extremely unfavorable to their Cloud Sky branch. Once the 2 Tianyang branches groups met, the strength of the Tianyang branch on the floating mountain would rise to an extremely frightening level. Chapter 818. It was easy to imagine just how powerful the Tianyang faction would be when they arrived at the floating mountain. The first to attack would definitely be the Cloud Sky faction. At that time, how are they going to defend themselves? In such a situation, there were only 2 choices in front of him. One was to retreat out of fear and leave the floating mountain. However, while this seemed safe, it would undoubtedly destroy their own future. If they retreated out of fear, now their Cloud Sky faction would no longer have any chance of gaining a foothold in the Sky Desert. However, even though they knew how terrible this choice was, they couldn't easily make a decision. That was the other choice. This was because they would have to face the Tianyang faction head-on. However, when the 2 groups from the Tianyang faction gathered, would they still have the strength to face them head-on? As a result, the atmosphere among the Cloud Sky faction disciples on the Crystal Essence Treasure Land had become extremely oppressive. Amidst the oppressive atmosphere, the gazes of many disciples turned towards the 4 geniuses from the Tian Fujing 7th floor at the very front. They knew very well that, at this moment, the right to make the decision rested with the 4 of them. If they didn't have such a top disciple leading them, no matter how many disciples they had below them, they wouldn't have the strength to fight against the other factions. Even though Ba Hong and the other 3 had always been the center of attention, they still felt quite a bit of pressure at this moment. After all, they understood that their decision would affect the fate of so many of their disciples and even the entire Cloud Sky faction in the Sky Desert battle. A single misstep would consign them to eternal damnation. As such, they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Otherwise, even the 4 of them wouldn't be able to bear the consequences. However, no matter how great the pressure was, the 4 of them knew very well that their Cloud Sky faction couldn't back down or run away at this moment. Running away seemed safe, but in reality, the consequences were no different from being directly eliminated. As a result, not long after, the 4 of them looked at each other. Their expressions were dignified as they announced to the surrounding disciples who had raised their heads. Their Cloud Sky faction would not be afraid in the slightest on the floating mountain. When the 4 of them said this, many disciples of the Cloud Sky faction couldn't help but become extremely excited. The originally oppressive atmosphere was naturally swept away. All the disciples had firm expressions on their faces as they fearlessly looked in the direction where the Tianyang group of disciples had left. Feeling the rising atmosphere around him, even Yen Chutian couldn't help but be infected by the atmosphere. A hint of excitement appeared on his face. At the same time, he also believed that only by fearlessly resisting could his Cloud Heaven bloodline truly become powerful. If they were afraid and fled before the battle even began, then no matter how many disciples they had, they would only be at the bottom of the 8 factions. At the same time, sensing Yen Chutian's affected expression, my honey couldn't help but chuckle and whisper, "I didn't expect you to be so hot-blooded. Looking at your appearance, I really wonder if you are an old man who has lived for hundreds of years, or have already lived a lifetime. Hearing my honey's teasing words, although Yen Chutian's reaction was indifferent, his heart couldn't help but skip a beat. This was because he never thought that my honey's teasing words would actually hit the nail on the head. However, he also knew that my honey was really just teasing him, so he replied with a faint smile. "Ha! Senior Sister Han, you must be joking." My honey couldn't help but frown when she heard him call her senior Sister Han-i. However, with her thick skin, she couldn't say any words of dissatisfaction and could only snort softly. Sensing my honey's dissatisfaction, Yen Chutian seemed rather helpless. He didn't forget Yen Chutian from that day, but he still wasn't used to directly calling him by his name. Therefore, he settled for the next best thing and called her senior sister. In short, after the atmosphere of the crowd was stirred up, the enormous group of Cloud Sky disciples once again returned to searching for crystal essences, refining and absorbing them like before. However, the atmosphere among the disciples faintly became tense. Evidently, the words of the commander disciple from the Tianyang faction that day had pressured them. Under this pressure, all the disciples couldn't help but become even more solemn than before. At the same time, on the other side of the vast floating mountain, the two groups of Tianyang disciples finally met under a certain peak. In front of the two groups, the 7 figures with powerful auras that could oppress any cultivator from the Tianfujing 6th floor gathered together at this moment. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that this group of people was the strongest on the floating mountain. However, when the two groups met at this moment, the latter couldn't help but ridicule the former. After all, it was because of the former that the Tianyang faction had become a rare laughingstock among the disciples of the various factions. Shan Wuling, I didn't think that you guys couldn't even deal with the ants from the Cloud Sky faction. The enchanting red-clothed Lu Yenji mocked. Beside her, Lu Binghan didn't say anything, but the expression on her face didn't conceal her ridicule at all. Although Shan Wuling felt humiliated by the two women's ridicule, he couldn't refute it. He could only lower his head and remain silent. Fortunately, at this moment, another proud disciple from the Tianfujing 7th floor frowned and said, "Lu Yenji, this time the Cloud Sky faction took advantage of our luck and rushed over to provide reinforcements in advance. Otherwise, the disciples from the Cloud Sky faction would have all been eliminated by our hands." However, hearing his words, the black-armored Fang Xiang from Lu Yenji and Lu Binghan's side narrowed his eyes and said with a faint smile, "You're wrong. That's not right. In my heavenly son lineage, failure is failure. How can there be a reason?" The atmosphere, gradually turned subtle. In the end, a cold glint flashed through Shan Wuling's eyes as he slowly spoke. "Enough. According to the rules of our Tianyang faction, this is my failure. That is undeniable. However, the most important thing right now is to return this humiliation to the Cloud Sky faction and the Profound Spirit faction several times over. Otherwise, even if I, Shen Wuling, receive a severe punishment, I will not be able to restore the face of our Tianyang faction." Shen Wuling's words were very reasonable. In the end, Lu Yenji and Fang Xiang could only snort coldly and say nothing. After that, they could only ask, "What do you have in mind? The Cloud Sky faction should know of our arrival. Furthermore, after experiencing what happened before, they definitely won't fall for another trap so easily." Shen Wuling seemed to have anticipated those words. He directly said, "Since it is impossible for us to make a hidden move, we will directly invite them into the trap. Although this floating sky mountain is profound, it is of a higher level than the crystal marrow treasure lands. However, no matter how many crystal marrow treasures there is still a difference in quality. If I am not wrong, there is definitely a place in the floating sky mountain with the richest crystal marrow treasures. When that opportunity appears, it will definitely attract the attention of the other factions. At that time, the Cloud Sky faction and the Profound Spirit faction will definitely appear. At that time, as long as we borrow the strength of the Kong Tong faction, even if the Cloud Sky faction and the Profound Spirit faction join forces again, they will not be able to escape the fate of elimination under our strength. As Shan Wuling spoke, his gaze swept around. However, no one objected. This was because they had to admit that what Shan Wuling said was extremely likely to happen. With their current strength, as long as the Cloud Sky faction and the Profound Spirit faction dared to approach, they could completely defeat them. While the Tianyang faction had already thought of such a plan to invite them into the trap, the disciples of the 6 factions in various parts of the floating sky mountain also had their own thoughts. Everyone could vaguely feel that not long from now, on this floating mountain, there was definitely going to be a major clash between the various factions. And the scale of this battle was probably only at the end of the Sky Desert when the 8 factions fought. As for now, it was just the calm before the storm. Under a certain valley, Yen Chutan, who had been quietly sitting cross-legged for a long time, finally let out a long breath of turbid air. Then he opened his eyes and couldn't help but reveal a trace of joy on his face. Just a moment ago, he had finally finished studying the 5,200 feet sky palace in his body. At this moment, he was already at the peak of the Tianfujing 4th floor, or rather, at the 5th level of the Sky Palace realm. Chapter 819. However, even if he had reached the peak of the Tianfujing 4th floor, Yen Chutian was very clear that it was still insufficient to deal with the current situation. He could also clearly feel the atmosphere before the storm. Therefore, he fully expected that the chaotic battle between the various factions of the inner sect would soon erupt on the floating mountain. Even a cultivator at the 5th level of the Heaven Palace realm could only be considered ordinary in such a grand scene. At the very least, one had to reach the Tianfujing 6th floor in order to stand out and have the possibility of leading the direction of this chaotic battle. After all, even though the number of basic disciples was not small, they were an extremely huge force. However, the ones at the center were still the upper disciples. Only when the upper disciples opened up the situation could the disciples under them be able to raise their morale and defeat their opponents in one go. Therefore, to Yen Chutan, he had to break through to the 5th level of the Heaven Palace realm before the storm truly arrived. However, he also understood that this matter could not be rushed. After all, if he wanted to break through, he had to find a quasi-7th grade crystal essence, or even a true 7th grade crystal essence. However, regardless of whether it was the latter or the former, how could it be easy to find? Therefore, Yen Chutian did not dare to hold too much hope in his heart. He understood that the greater the expectation, the greater the disappointment. However, although he did not hold much hope, he would definitely not give up on the possibility of finding such a high-grade crystal essence. Every time he found the location of a treasure trove of crystal essence, he spared no effort to search in the mountains where the aura of crystal essence was dense. He wished that he could see through the earth beneath his feet. However, after a few days, even though he had changed locations several times, he still could not find even the slightest trace of a high-grade crystal essence. Such a situation naturally caused the expectations that he had intentionally lowered in his heart to be infinitely lowered. However, it was precisely when one's luck was disappointing that it would suddenly appear and shake one's heart. After another treasure trove of crystal essence, Yen Chutan, who was originally about to give up, suddenly sensed that there seemed to be an extremely special essence aura in the shadow of the mountain. This essence aura was special because Yen Chutian could not really sense the existence of this crystal essence aura. However, when his spiritual eye inadvertently swept over, he suddenly saw that there was actually a faint red aura that was constantly shrinking in the shadow. This situation might be difficult for others to detect, and even if they did, they would not know what it was. However, Yen Chutian was all too clear about what this situation meant. While his expression was filled with unconcealable excitement, he slowly approached the shadow. Spiritual energy gathered in his hand, condensing into a blade of light. As the light blade fell, the ground in the shadow slowly. After the soil was lifted, one could see that there was actually a piece of bright red crystal essence. In this crystal essence, 7 blood-colored balls of essence were extremely dazzling. Although the last ball of essence was somewhat exquisite and dim, there was no doubt that it was actually a quasi-7th grade crystal essence. Seeing the quasi-7th grade crystal essence under the soil, Yen Chutian could not hide the shock on his face. However, in fact, when he saw the special essence aura of this quasi-7th grade crystal essence, he had more or less expected it. This was because he knew too well that crystal essences above the 7th grade could not only produce true crystal essence saliva, but they were also extremely different from ordinary crystal essences in other aspects. For example, if a 7th grade crystal essence had not been touched, its original essence aura would be extremely hidden. Only the faint red aura that spread out would be easy to detect. Only after it had been touched would the aura of the crystal essence be released. However, just as Yen Chutian was about to pick up this quasi-7th grade crystal essence with incomparable excitement, a sudden burst of powerful spiritual energy shot out from behind him. However, he didn't expect that an extremely fierce spiritual energy would suddenly burst out from the darkness. He had no choice but to temporarily give up on the crystal marrow in front of him and circulate his spiritual energy to turn around and defend himself. But even if Yen Chutian's reaction was extremely fast and the vast amount of spiritual energy rapidly gathered around him, when the spiritual light burst out, it was still able to forcibly tear apart his defense. Then, with the remaining power of the spiritual light, he was forced to retreat several feet. After quickly stabilizing himself, Yen Chutian immediately looked at the source of the spiritual energy that had suddenly burst out. Generally speaking, if someone approached, he would be able to detect it immediately. However, this time it was not only because he was wholeheartedly searching for the crystal essence, but also because the other party had hidden so well that he actually did not detect it. His gaze quickly locked onto the source, and when he saw the figure of the source, his narrowed eyes turned completely cold. It was because this figure was none other than the young man from the Tianfujing 6th floor who had stood in front of Ba Xian and targeted him that day. After seeing his face clearly, Yen Chutian could completely imagine that the other party had not come here by chance, but had been secretly watching him all along under Ba Xian's instructions. Now, it was obvious that it was difficult for him to hide because he had discovered a quasi-7th grade crystal essence. This was because even a cultivator from the Tianfujing 6th floor could not resist the temptation of a quasi-7th grade crystal essence. If this quasi-crystal essence was used properly, even if it could not help a cultivator from the Tianfujing 6th floor break through, it could at least greatly improve or refine their own Tianfujing sanctum. The situation was just as Yen Chutian had thought. Tai Yen had been secretly watching for a long time, and when he finally saw the quasi-7th grade crystal essence, he could no longer suppress his desire. Even he had never possessed a quasi-7th grade crystal essence. If he could get it, he had no doubt that it would help him greatly improve the foundation of his Tianfujing sanctum. Therefore, after forcing Yen Chutian to retreat, he did not even hesitate to reach out and grab the quasi-7th grade crystal essence. However, he had discovered this crystal essence with great difficulty, so how could Yen Chutian just watch it be taken away by the other party? As the big hand of spiritual energy reached out, Yen Chutian once again turned his palm into a knife. The extremely sharp knife hand whizzed out, even tearing the space apart, and chopped straight at the big hand of spiritual energy that was reaching for the crystal essence. His hand rose, and the knife fell. In the blink of an eye, Yen Chutian's knife hand chopped down the big hand of spiritual energy. It was also because of this that the greed in Tai Yan's eyes abruptly subsided. At this moment, he seemed to have suddenly remembered that the guy on the Tianfujing 4th floor in front of him could not be looked at with ordinary eyes. In the chaotic battle in the valley that day, even among the Tianyang branch, there was a guy from the Tianfujing 6th floor who looked down on him too much, so he was directly eliminated by his strange means. However, Tai Yan was still very confident in his heart. He felt that as long as he was careful, even if the guy in front of him was extremely strange, it was impossible for him to be his opponent. However, in order to avoid unnecessary trouble, he did not make another move. Instead, he slowly opened his mouth and said, I, Tai Yan, was the first to discover this crystal essence. If you know what's good for you, you should leave as soon as possible. Otherwise, you should also know what's right in this sky desert and even in the firmament God Palace. Listening to Tai Yan's half-domineering and half-suggestive words, Yan Chutian could not help but smile coldly. Tai Yan really thought of himself as the kind of shrimp that he could scare away with his intimidation. It was not that there were no such guys who wanted to take things from Yan Chutian, but at least they were not like him. If you want to rob it, just say it. In this place where there is no one, why say any beautiful words? Yan Chutian said to Tai Yan with extreme ridicule, listening to his words. How could Tai Yan have a good face? His face was constantly gloomy and cold. In the end, he hit it again and shouted coldly, Reckless thing! You thought that you could really show off in front of the cultivators of the Tianfujing 6th floor by defeating a fool of the Tianyang branch when he was unprepared? Today, you will pay the price for your arrogance. After the cold shout, Tai Yan no longer hesitated. The spiritual power around his body surged out wildly, and a huge pressure suppressed the surrounding heaven and earth. It was so oppressive that the space was broken. It directly burst out and whistled toward Yan Chutian. Although he did not want to cause more trouble, he also saw that the guy in front of him was not the kind of guy who would be beaten back. Moreover, this timing was also very good. When he had seriously injured him, even if someone came to find him, he could use him to sneak attack him and want to rob the crystal essence from him. In this way, it was killing two birds with one stone. Chapter 820. A huge amount of spiritual power swept out, crushing the heaven and earth. Even the surrounding space in front of him was directly crushed by the pressure. In the broken space of heaven and earth, Tai Yan was surrounded by dazzling light as he shot toward Yan Chutian. Ordinary cultivators at the 5th level of the Heaven Mansion stage might be afraid of such an attack, but Yan Chutian was completely different. Looking at the astonishing power that swept over, he slowly formed a seal. As he formed a seal, the Shenyang qi in his body suddenly began to circulate crazily. Immediately after, in front of his chest, a spatial crack that seemed to connect to a different world gradually appeared between heaven and earth. This was the Shenyang swallow. Yan Chutian naturally had some thoughts about using the Shenyang swallow at the beginning, because he knew very well that although Tai Yan was still overbearing, he would not underestimate him. Therefore, if he fought with his own strength, it would still be a bit difficult. Secondly, in this battle, it was impossible to eliminate the other party. Since that was the case, why use all means to fight to the last moment? He might as well take advantage of the fact that the other party was unprepared. As long as he got the crystal marrow, he could escape directly. Could it be that Tai Yan could reverse black and white in front of so many disciples and cover the sky with one hand? In the blink of an eye, Tai Yan burst out. The palm in his hand carried an astonishing destructive power as it slammed toward Yan Chutian. The Shenyang swallow formed by the latter's seal finally took shape. It went without saying what happened next. When the two collided, the Shenyang swallow immediately burst out with an extremely terrifying devouring power, swallowing all the astonishing palm power. Although he had long known that the other party had extremely strange means, at this moment, seeing it with his own eyes, Tai Yan's heart and even face were inevitably shocked. He could feel how terrifying the devouring power was. When his palm slammed down, the connection with his own attack was completely cut off in an instant, and the situation that followed could be imagined. With the connection cut off, he could only watch as his attack was quickly swallowed by the spatial crack. However, Tai Yan also knew that the attack was not the end. He knew that Yan Chutian was still able to perfectly reflect the enemy's spirit art attack in an almost unharmed manner and return the attack back. Therefore, in the next moment, he once again urged his spiritual energy to form a spiritual barrier in front of his body, firmly protecting himself. He had a sense of propriety when it came to his own offensive power. As a result, he was able to control the defensive power to the greatest extent and not waste a single bit of power. He didn't believe it. Could it be that his opponent could endlessly devour attacks and spit them back out? In Tai Yan's opinion, it was only 2 or 3 times at most. The opponent's strange attack should have reached its limit, but it could not be launched. At that time, it would be the time for him to make his move. Unfortunately, there were 2 big mistakes in his way of thinking. Firstly, it was impossible for Yan Chutian to use the mysterious Yang swallow and mysterious Yang spit in succession within a short period of time. However, the biggest mistake was that Yan Chutian had no intention of competing with him here. From the beginning to the end, there was only one thought in his mind, and that was to get the quasi-7th grade crystal marrow. All in all, the next situation was exactly as Tai Yan had expected from the beginning. While he was condensing his defense, Yan Chutian had already reversed the seal in his hand, gradually transforming the powerful devouring power of the mysterious Yang swallow into a destructive force that was spat out. In the next moment, from the reversed space crack, a destructive force that was almost the same as Tai Yan's previous palm power rushed out crazily toward the outside world. As for the final goal, it was naturally Tai Yan who was sneering under the layers of spiritual barriers. In his opinion, the situation was as he had expected. Then, the result was that Yan Yin would definitely be defeated by his own hands. Boom! A thunderous boom reverberated throughout the heavens and earth. The power that swept out was not weak, but the final result was that under Tai Yan's sneer, it was almost annihilated at the same time as the spiritual barrier in front of him. This all proved that Tai Yan's grasp of his own power had reached an extremely clear level. However, when the 2 forces melted, and his eyes looked toward Yan Chutian, the sneer in his eyes became unprecedentedly ugly. This was because not only was the other party not shocked by his precise grasp of power, but he also did not wait for an opportunity to attack him. Instead, he directly grabbed the quasi-7th grade crystal marrow without looking back. Tai Yan was not a fool. He could quickly figure out what Yan Chutian's intention was, but it was precisely because he thought of it that it was more and more difficult for him to accept. Because this meant that the other party had no intention of fighting with him at all. And from the looks of it, all those thoughts he had before, were they not just his own foolish fantasies? Damn it! With a roar of rage, how could Tai Yan hesitate in the slightest? He immediately controlled his spiritual energy, and the violent power in his hand swept out like a wave, directly shrouding Yan Chutian. However, how could Yan Chutian, who had already taken the lead, be easily hit by it? Sensing the astonishing fluctuations behind him, he calmly reached out and grabbed the bright red crystal marrow into his bag. Then he used the profound shadow. His figure was like a ghost, disappearing from the original place, naturally avoiding the power that enveloped him. Therefore, Tai Yan's angry attack could only destroy the ground in a mess at most. When the loud roar sounded, Yan Chutian's figure gradually appeared on the low slope. He looked down and saw Tai Yan, whose face was full of unsightly and anger. He did not hide his ridicule and ridicule. Next time, if you want to rob something, it's better to use your brain first. As soon as his voice fell, he did not care about Tai Yan's reaction. With a step of his right foot, his figure had already sped toward the rear. That was the valley where the disciples of the 2 teams of their Cloud Sky clan gathered. Fighting was not allowed there. After all, there were many disciples who were recovering or even cultivating. As a result, even if he gave Tai Yan 10 guts, he would never dare to chase after him. However, as he watched the other party leave, he thought of the ridicule that the other party had said before he left. It was as if he was mocking a fool. How could his heart calm down? His anger was like a volcano that could erupt at any time. However, in the end, reason prevailed over anger. Tai Yin gritted his teeth and did not chase after him. He only continuously slapped the ground with his palm, creating dense cracks in order to vent the anger in his heart. At the same time, Yan Chutian had already rushed back to the valley where many disciples were sitting cross-legged. As soon as he rushed back, he familiarly descended towards the position that Mai Hani had reserved for him. Mai Hani was already very popular, not to mention that she had now stepped onto the Tianfujing 6th floor. Her cultivation was even ranked in the upper echelons of the disciples, so naturally, no one dared to say anything about it. Moreover, the most they could say was that they were jealous of Yan Chutian. After all, anyone who saw that Mai Hani was actually taking care of a man would inevitably feel a trace of jealousy. Sensing Yan Chutian's aura, Mai Hani slowly opened her beautiful eyes. When she sensed that the former's mood seemed to be exceptionally high, she could not help but slightly open her red lips. Why? Could it be that finding a 7th grade crystal essence made you so happy? Hearing this, Yan Chutian just smiled and did not say anything. Seeing his appearance, Mai Hani, who was originally smiling, could not help but widen her beautiful eyes and say again, "You really found a 7th grade crystal essence?" It was no wonder that Mai Hani had such a reaction. Even she had not obtained a true 7th grade crystal essence. At this point, Yan Chutian did not hide anything from Mai Hani. He immediately used his spiritual energy to conceal his aura and took out the quasi-7th grade crystal essence. After a glance, although she could see that this crystal essence was not a true 7th grade crystal essence, its quasi-7th grade crystal essence was enough to shock Mai Hani. Then she thought that with Yan Chutian's current state, he was probably going to use this quasi-7th grade crystal essence to break through to the 5th level of the Heaven Mansion stage. Thinking of this, although she was happy for Yan Chutian in her heart, she did not forget to pretend to be dissatisfied and lightly snorted. "I didn't expect that I would be caught up by you so soon after being stronger than you for such a short time." Chapter 821. Compared to others, Mai Hani, who had gone through life and death with Yan Chutian, was naturally more aware of the former's strength. Therefore, she could estimate that if Yan Chutian broke through to the 5th level of the Heaven Palace stage, he would be able to compete with the Tianfujing 6th floor cultivators. Yan Chutian did not refute Mai Hani's words because Mai Hani's thoughts were almost the same as his. If he stepped into the 5th level of the Heaven Palace stage, the range of his Heaven Palace should be able to reach 6,700 feet. Such a vast Heaven Palace foundation was something that many Tianfujing 6th floor cultivators couldn't possess. Therefore, it didn't matter even if they didn't have time to polish it. Therefore, why would he need to be afraid of the Tianfujing 6th floor cultivators? In other words, the higher his cultivation level, the greater the Heaven Palace foundation he could possess, and the more shocking it would be for him to be able to fight those above his level. However, Yan Chutian was also clear that if this situation were to continue, there would definitely be a significant decrease in the number of gold disciples. After all, the golden disciples were geniuses, second only to the highest level jade tablet in their respective factions. Naturally, the range of the Heaven Palace in their bodies couldn't be underestimated. Moreover, Yan Chutian himself knew that being able to become a jade tablet disciple after stepping into the Heavenly Source stage wasn't just based on the fact that he had stepped into the Heavenly Source stage. More importantly, they had to show that they were not weak in terms of talent or strength. One could imagine that the range of one's foundation in the Heaven Palace stage was definitely an extremely important criterion. However, Yan Chutian hadn't experienced so much in his previous life. This was because after his master brought him back to the Cloud Sky faction in his previous life, he had always been cultivating in secret. Very few people knew about him. Later on, when he revealed himself, he was already one of the best in the Heavenly Source stage. He even directly obtained the position of the number 1 disciple of the Cloud Sky faction. Everyone knew what happened after that. Yan Chutian's life was smooth sailing from beginning to end. He became the #1 disciple of the Firmament Palace and eventually became one of the top 10 geniuses of the Heaven Realm. However, he had infiltrated the God domain after reaching the 8th Heaven Genesis stage. Back to the main topic, as long as he could break through to the 5th level of the Tian-Fuging 7th floor, he wouldn't need to fear anyone. If he was given more time to carefully polish his heaven sanctum, then even the disciples of the Tian-Fuging 7th floor would find it difficult to look down on him. However, this was something that would happen after the breakthrough. If he couldn't break through, everything would just be empty talk. All his hopes were pinned on the quasi-grade 7 crystal marrow in his hands. Slowly sitting down in the crowd, Yen Chutian was not polite to my Hani at all. He immediately looked at her expectantly. "Senior Sister Hani, I'll leave the rest to you." Wu Hani was well aware of the meaning behind Yen Chutian's words. But upon hearing those words, other than nodding in agreement, what else could he do? Seeing Wu Hani nod his head, how could Yen Chutian possibly hesitate? He immediately sat down cross-legged and began to slowly refine the crimson crystal essence in his palm that had its aura concealed. Seeing this, my Hani was obviously a little worried. She formed a seal with her jade-like hands and condensed a spiritual energy barrier around Yen Chutian, who was sitting cross-legged. Although the possibility of someone daring to make a move in such a place was infinitely close to zero, but for the sake of safety, she still set up such a defense. After setting up the defense, my Hani sat down cross-legged near Yen Chutian and slowly studied her own heaven sanctum. Not long after she entered the Tian-Fuging 6th floor, her own heaven's sanctum foundation needed to be tempered. At the same time, on the other side, no matter how angry he was, Taiyan finally adjusted his state of mind and appeared in the crowd with a gloomy face. Seeing Taiyan's figure, Ba Xian hurriedly walked out. He saw that Ba Xian's expression was a little off, but he felt that it was a little strange. The other party should be spying on Yan Yan. But just spying, how could he show such a face? Tai Yan was furious, so even when he saw Ba Xian approaching, he did not give him a good face. This made Ba Xian's expression not very good, but there was nothing he could do. After all, he still entrusted the other party to find trouble with Yan Yan. Almost ignoring Ba Xian, Tai Yan only looked coldly at Yen Chutian. But now Yen Chutian could not notice his gaze. What he could feel was my Hani who was guarding beside him. Quietly adjusting his state of mind, Yen Chutian did not officially start refining the quasi-grade 7 crystal marrow in his hand until an hour later. As he slowly refined it, wisps of extremely pure crystal marrow power flowed rapidly into his body through the wings of his nose and finally converged into the heaven sanctum. During this process, if Yen Chutian had not deliberately concealed it, the extremely rich aura of the crystal marrow would have attracted the attention of many disciples around him. As the power of the crystal marrow continued to converge, Yen Chutian did not dare to relax his mind at all. Instead, he absorbed the power of the crystal marrow and hurriedly grasped the mystery of breaking through the boundary wall. However, it seemed that every breakthrough was destined to be full of twists and turns. Because of this, he could not grasp the traces of the breakthrough for a full 2 hours. This made Yen Chutian a little anxious, because even if he slowed down, the crystal marrow in his hand had almost been refined by him. If he still did not gain anything, he was afraid that his attempt to break through this time would only end in failure. However, despite his anxiety, many years of experience eventually allowed Yen Chutian to gradually stabilize his state of mind. Because it was useless to be anxious, it was better to use the last bit of crystal marrow power to make one last attempt at breaking through instead of doing something useless. It seemed that the heavens were looking out for Yen Chutian, or that after all the twists and turns, there would always be a rainbow. After one last attempt at breaking through, Yen Chutian finally grasped the traces of the breakthrough in the illusory world. It was also at this moment that the tiny, yuanying figure sitting cross-legged in his heaven's sanctum finally opened its eyes. Then, as it slowly rose, heavy energy axes continuously condensed in its hands and around its body. Since he had grasped the traces of the breakthrough, the following process was naturally no problem for an experienced Yen Chutan. It could almost be described as smooth sailing. Half a day later, Yen Chutian had truly stepped into the 5th level of the Heaven's Sanctum Realm. The moment he broke through to the 5th level of the Heaven's Sanctum Realm, even if Yen Chutian had concealed himself, there was still an energy ripple emanating from his body. As long as one did not deliberately ignore it, everyone would be able to sense that the energy ripple should have reached the 5th level of the Heaven's Sanctum Realm. When they looked in the direction of the movement, they could naturally see where the energy ripple originated from. Of course, it was not difficult to figure out that Yen Chutian had probably broken through to the 5th level of the Heaven's Sanctum Realm. If an ordinary disciple had broken through to the 5th level of the Heaven's Sanctum Realm, they would at most take a glance before shifting their gazes away. However, the target was Yen Chutian. Even if they did not want to, they simply could not do it. This was because Yen Chutian's performance in the past could not be viewed with common sense. Based on the strength that he had previously displayed, now that he had broken through to the 5th level of the Heaven's Sanctum Realm, even the Taiyan-fuging 6th floor cultivators would be nothing in front of him. Of course, this was only what everyone thought. Without seeing it with their own eyes, no one knew what would happen. Therefore, many disciples of the Taiyan-fuging 6th floor, especially those at the pinnacle and perfection level, had paid attention to Yen Chutian, but they did not pay much attention to him. To be able to reach such a level, they all had their own pride. Naturally, they would not easily think that a cultivator at the 5th level of the Heaven's Sanctum Realm would be so powerful. Although the other party could not be viewed with ordinary eyes, as long as they treated him seriously and did not underestimate him, then the other party would still be nothing. Looking at Yen Chutian, Taiyan's face became extremely gloomy again. This was because he completely guessed that Lin Yun had probably refined the quasi-7th grade crystal marrow to be able to break through to the 5th level of the Heaven's Sanctum Realm. In his view, it was a huge waste for a quasi-7th grade crystal marrow to be used on breaking through to the 5th level of the Heaven's Sanctum Realm. That level of crystal marrow should belong to him, allowing him to advance towards the pinnacle and perfection level of the Taiyan-fuging 6th floor. Only in this way could the overall strength of the Cloud Sky bloodline increase a little. Chapter 8:22. The energy ripples spread out and quickly returned to calmness. When the energy ripples returned to calmness, Yen Chutian naturally opened his eyes after sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed for a long time. Opening his eyes, even the current Yen Chutian could not restrain the joy on his face, because it was as he had thought before. He had truly broken through to the 5th level of the Heaven Mansion stage, and the range of the Heavenly Palace did not disappoint his expectations. From the original 5,200 feet, it expanded to a range of 6,800 feet. With such a huge foundation of the Heavenly Palace, even if it had not been polished in any way, it still made him feel that his foundation was extremely abundant. Even if it was a cultivator from the Taiyan-fuging 6th floor, he could forget about taking any advantage from his hands. As a result, he did not restrain his aura and immediately cast a gaze filled with fighting spirit in the direction of Taiyan. The current him was no longer the same as before. If the other party still dared to find trouble with him, then he did not mind letting him know that the current situation between the two of them was no longer the same as before. Of course, he would not forget the real culprit behind all of this, that Ba Xian. He would naturally find an opportunity to settle the score with him. But in reality, the current Ba Xian was nothing in Yen Chutian's eyes. At most, he was just a clown who relied on Ba Hong's power to secretly make moves. Yen Chutian's gaze, one could imagine how gloomy and angry the face of Taiyan, who was already unwilling and jealous, would become at this moment. It was hard for him to imagine that the other party had become so arrogant. Could it be that he thought that just because he had stepped into the 5th level of the Heaven Mansion stage, he could still accumulate his strength to fight above his level to the Tianfujing 6th floor? In the past, it was only because he despicably showed weakness to the enemy that he was able to take advantage of the opportunity to launch a sneak attack and even succeed in the sneak attack. But if he lost this early stage, what could he be considered as in an open and above-board manner? The anger in Tai Yan's heart surged. But no matter how turbulent it was, he had no choice but to suppress it, because right now was definitely not the time to make a move. Moreover, he suddenly thought that this was probably done on purpose by Yan Yun in order to provoke him. If he really lost control of his anger, wouldn't he have fallen for his despicable trick? However, it was obvious that he was thinking too much. Yan Chutian wouldn't think so much about him. After all, he was no longer an enemy that was difficult to defeat to the former. The glare was just a subconscious way of venting the anger of being secretly targeted by the former. Therefore, in the next moment, Yan Chutian returned to normal. Then he continued to sit cross-legged and stabilize his cultivation. Since Yan Chutian had already broken through, my honey naturally did not need to be as solemn as before. Thus, she lifted her jade-like hand and dispersed the spiritual energy barrier. Then her red lips parted slightly as she said, "Congratulations on truly breaking through to the 5th level of the Heaven Mansion stage. What? Do you want to strike while the iron is hot and borrow some more crystal essences from me to polish your Heaven Palace as soon as possible?" Hearing my honey's soft words, Yan Chutian raised his eyebrows because he really didn't have a single crystal essence on him now. If he could borrow some more crystal essences, it would be for the best. However, what made him a little suspicious was that my honey seemed to be a little too nice to him. He hadn't even paid back the crystal essences he borrowed the last time, yet she was still willing to lend them to him? He definitely couldn't accept someone else's kindness for no reason. However, he couldn't let go of the crystal essences that were delivered to his doorstep. Thus, after hesitating for a moment, Yan Chutian immediately said, "Senior Sister Honey, I can't thank you enough for your kindness. In the future, as long as Senior Sister has any instructions, Yan Yun will definitely not refuse, even if it means climbing a mountain of swords or diving into a sea of fire." Due to Yan Chutian's sudden words, my honey couldn't help but be at a loss. However, what made her happy was that it sounded like Yan Chutian owed her a request. This sounded extremely good. In the future, if there was anything she was dissatisfied with, she could use this request to ask him directly until she was satisfied. With that thought in mind, my honey's next action of taking out the crystal essences was even more extravagant. She only left behind some crystal essences for herself to polish her divine abode in the next few days. Then, she lent the rest of the resources to Yan Chutian. Of course, although she said she was lending them, my honey had never thought of returning them at all. Although they had both admitted that they were friends, my honey had always thought that they could only maintain a relationship with each other if they were involved in some substantial relationship. Otherwise, if they weren't involved, their relationship would fade with the passage of time, no matter how nice it sounded. However, my honey didn't want their relationship to fade away because of time. After getting the crystal essences from my honey, Yan Chutian's next step was even simpler. He didn't even need to look for the crystal essences. He could directly refine the ones in his hands and polish his divine abode. However, when it came to polishing, Yan Chutian realized how huge the amount of crystal essences he needed to polish his divine abode was. The crystal essences that my honey gave him were of good quality, and there were even several pieces of 5th-grade crystal essences. However, after refining them, the polishing effect was extremely poor. After another half a day, he exhausted all the crystal essences in his hands. However, the effect was only to refine the Heaven Palace in his body by 2,000 feet. However, Yan Chutian wasn't too disappointed. After all, he knew that the more difficult the polishing of his divine abode was, the greater his foundation would be. In other words, if he could easily polish his divine abode, it would mean that his divine abode's foundation would be extremely weak. It would also be impossible for him to have the strength to fight those above his level like before. Therefore, even though he had used up all the crystal essences, Yan Chutian's mood didn't change much. In any case, he just recovered to his previous state and continued to search for crystal essences in the floating mountain. However, just as Yan Chutian was thinking this, a light beam rippled and shot up to the sky from a huge mountain in the distance that seemed to be at the end of the horizon. Immediately after, an extremely ferocious beast roar resounded in the sky amidst the loud, rumbling sound. Enormous energy ripples spread out. Even though there was an extremely great distance between them, one could still feel an extremely large amount of pressure. Everyone could vaguely see a gigantic marrow beast roaring towards the sky on top of the collapsed mountain. The source of the gigantic pressure was none other than this beast. Looking at this scene, even though he didn't know what was going on, Yan Chutan could faintly sense that the appearance of this marrow beast was the beginning of a storm. Even though they were quite a distance away, he could still vaguely sense that this marrow beast's strength had most likely reached the 8th level of the divine abode stage. To be able to nurture such a marrow beast, it wasn't difficult to imagine what level of crystal essences existed in the collapsed mountain. This scene was clearly visible to everyone. In other words, as long as one had a bit of insight, they would be able to guess what he was thinking. In other words, it wouldn't be long before all the disciples of the floating mountain gathered around the giant mountain. After all, everyone had come here for the sake of this opportunity. Therefore, at this moment, when the greatest opportunity had appeared, how could they give it up? This was also the case for the Cloud Sky faction that Yan Chutian was in, whether it was Ba Hong, Yuanyang, or Zhang Yu. They could also imagine that such a commotion would definitely attract the disciples of the various factions, including the Tianyang faction. But even if they knew, the 4 of them didn't hesitate at all. They immediately ordered all the disciples to head towards the source of the commotion. In the floating mountain, or rather in the sky desert, it was a fight for opportunities. Therefore, they were very clear that if the opportunity appeared and they didn't even have the courage to fight for it, what was the difference between that and failure? Therefore, even if the Tianyang faction stood in front of them, they still had to go. Moreover, they didn't believe that the Tianyang faction would dare to act against them when all the disciples of the various factions were gathered. Weren't they afraid that others would take advantage of them? Moreover, apart from the Kongtong faction, as long as the disciples of the other factions weren't fools, they definitely wouldn't watch the Tianyang faction dominate and act so arrogantly. All in all, under the lead of the 4 people, the disciples of the Cloud Sky faction all controlled their spiritual energies and turned into streaks of light as they charged towards the collapsed mountain, even though they had complicated thoughts in their hearts. At the same time, the entire floating mountain was filled with such scenes. The storm had finally descended. Chapter 8:23. The originally calm atmosphere in the floating mountain range was completely shattered by the collapse of the giant mountain and the ferocious roar of the enormous marrow beast. Immediately after, countless streaks of light shot over from all over the world. The target of these streaks of light was, without exception, the floating mountain. This was because anyone who sensed the strength of the marrow beast would not find it hard to imagine that there was an extremely high grade of crystal marrow within the mountain. Otherwise, no matter how many crystal marrow there were, without the stimulation of high-grade crystal marrow, the marrow beast would not be able to break through the crystal marrow level. After all, the birth of the marrow beast was an extremely coincidental situation. A marrow beast that was born from crystal marrow would naturally not be of a higher grade than crystal marrow. All in all, within a short period of time, there were figures whizzing over from various parts of the floating mountain, descending around the collapsed giant mountain. Yan Chutian looked over and could clearly see the Tianyang, Kongtong, Xianling, Tianjin, and Freezing Sky factions. Including the Cloud Sky faction, the 6 factions that had appeared had already surpassed half of the 8 factions. With such 6 factions, there was no need to doubt the strength of the Tianyang faction. The 2 factions from the Tianyang faction had gathered. Just the commander prodigies from the Tian Fujing 7th floor alone numbered 7. However, even if they excluded the Tianyang faction, the Cloud Sky faction was no longer the strongest among the remaining 5 factions. It could clearly be seen that the number of disciples from the Freezing Sky faction had also surpassed 1 faction. Moreover, the number of commander prodigies from the Tianfujing 7th floor had already reached 5. In other words, 3 factions had already sent reinforcements. Although the Kongtong faction did not have any reinforcements, there was no need to worry. After all, the Kongtong faction had always been extremely close to the Tianyang faction. Right now, although they did not look like they were walking together, once they started fighting, they would definitely walk together. The remaining Xianling faction and Tianjin faction seemed to be the weakest. However, they were obviously aware of this situation. Therefore, both sides seemed to have reached some kind of agreement and were now walking together. This was not strange to the Xianling lineage, but the Celestial Array lineage's actions clearly meant that they no longer wanted to remain neutral and wanted to take the initiative to compete. Therefore, rather than saying that there were 6 factions, it would be more accurate to say that there were only 4 factions left in the Hanging Mountain. The target of these 4 forces was the high-grade crystal marrow in the collapsed mountain. If the crystal marrow were to appear, the 4 forces would probably start fighting for it immediately. However, the marrow crystals hadn't really appeared yet, not to mention the enormous marrow beast that was poking its head out of the crack in the collapsed mountain. Everyone could clearly sense the strength of this marrow beast. It must have reached the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm. With such a marrow beast in front of them, not only would it be extremely difficult to kill it, but they were also worried that if they made a move against it, the disciples of the other factions would take the opportunity to launch a sneak attack on them. If they were ambushed, the situation would be extremely bad. With this powerful marrow beast in front of them and the disciples of the other factions attacking them from behind, they would probably be eliminated from the competition. Therefore, the geniuses of the various factions quickly suggested that they work together to kill the marrow beast first. Everyone agreed with this suggestion. Therefore, in the next moment, 2 commander-level geniuses from the Tianfujing 7th floor walked out from the 6 factions. The 12 disciples of the Tianfujing 7th floor from the 6 factions walked out. With such a joint force, they had no need to fear the marrow beast, even if it was at the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm. After all, the marrow beast was indeed powerful, but it didn't have intelligence. On the other hand, with the 12 of them working together, even if each of them had only just entered the Tianfujing 7th floor, the power they could unleash should be comparable to that of an ordinary 8th level Heaven Mansion realm cultivator. Moreover, if they still couldn't defeat it, the disciples of the 6 factions weren't just for show. They could provide support at any time. Since the suggestion was made, the 12 of them didn't linger. Each of them immediately controlled their spiritual power and charged towards the marrow beast that was at the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm. Although the marrow beast didn't have intelligence, it still had its instincts. Therefore, when the 12 of them rushed out, the marrow beast at the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm sensed them and immediately turned its head. Then, it quickly opened its ferocious mouth. The ferocious beast's mouth was like a black hole that could swallow heaven and earth, sucking in the surrounding space and creating a spatial gap. With such an absorption, one could imagine how terrifying the power accumulated in its mouth was. This kind of power caused the 8th level of the Heaven Palace realm marrow beast to roar as it shot out. Even the most elite of the various factions, not a single one of them dared to face it head-on, and they all dodged to the side. The energy beam whizzed past and directly tore apart the space between heaven and earth, revealing a huge spatial fault that wreaked havoc with an astonishing spatial power. After dodging such a blow, the 12 geniuses no longer hesitated. Otherwise, if they allowed the marrow beast to continue its wanton attacks, who knew if they would be hit by it unintentionally? The more they were dealing with a creature that only had power, the more they had to take the initiative in the battle in their own hands. In the next moment, spiritual power surged wildly in the hands of each of the 12 people. Then, All kinds of spiritual techniques appeared one by one and enveloped the marrow beast at the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm. However, at this time, the marrow beast at the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm also displayed its strength. As the myriad of attacks descended, it once again took a deep breath and sucked in a huge spatial depression. Then, when it exhaled and absorbed the power in its mouth, it had already turned into an extremely eye-catching purple flame. The purple flame melted and the space collapsed, making it difficult for it to exist. In front of this power, no matter how the myriad of attacks descended, they were all turned into nothingness by the purple flame. Looking at this scene, although the 12 people had more or less expected it, they couldn't help but reveal a trace of shock on their faces. Even they had to admit that even if it was just a marrow beast, as long as it stepped into the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm, its strength couldn't be ignored. If any one of them were to face it alone, or even 2 of them, they would probably end up in a very sorry state and might even be eliminated. However, there was no such ifs. At this moment, with the 12 of them attacking, even if the marrow beast at the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm was extremely strong, it would still fall before their eyes. The final result was indeed so. Even though the marrow beast at the 8th level of the Heaven Mansion realm was extremely strong, under the entanglement of the 12 people, its strength was ultimately exhausted bit by bit. Even in the end, the marrow beast felt the danger and wanted to escape. However, how could the others give it the chance? They immediately sealed off its escape route, and a dozen powerful spiritual techniques descended from the sky, enveloping the former like a storm. Roar! This time, no matter how strong the marrow beast was, it still let out an extremely mournful roar. When the energy ripples calmed down, it was even more clearly visible that there were already several hideous wounds on the marrow beast's body. In such a situation, it was almost obvious that the outcome was in the bag. Then, without any explanation, the 12 people once again gathered the spiritual energy in their hands. However, when the surging attacks descended this time, a shocking change suddenly occurred. It could clearly be seen that the 2 commander prides of the Tianyang faction didn't attack the marrow beast, but Zhang Yu and Ba Hong from the Cloud Sky faction. If it weren't for the fact that the 2 of them were already on guard, this attack would have seriously injured them. Even so, the 2 of them were forced to continuously retreat after forcefully blocking the attack, and the blood and qi in their bodies shook. However, no matter how much the blood and qi in their bodies shook, it couldn't compare to the furious expressions on their faces. They really didn't think that the disciples of the Tianyang faction would be so shameless. They actually went against the agreement and attacked in front of everyone. Because of this, it was obvious that Yuan Yang and the other disciples of the Cloud Sky faction wouldn't just watch and do nothing. They immediately released their spiritual energy and looked at the 2 commander prides of the Tianyang faction with extremely sharp gazes. Towards the reaction of Ba Hong, Zhang Yu, and the other disciples of the Cloud Sky faction, one of the prides of the Tianyang faction, Feng Xiang, who was dressed in black armor, had an indifferent expression and said with a faint smile, "Haha, it's just a joke." However, it seems that the disciples of the Cloud Sky faction aren't that bad. Chapter 824. Under the sharp gazes of the Cloud Sky bloodline, Feng Xiang spoke in such a casual manner. However, which Cloud Sky bloodline disciple would be so easily brushed aside by him? The disciples of the Cloud Sky bloodline were like this, not to mention Zhang Yu and Ba Hong, who were ambushed. Their expressions were extremely ugly, the 2 of them tightly locked onto Feng Xiang. Their cold gazes clearly indicated that it was impossible for the other party to easily brush aside the sneak attack just now. After all, that sneak attack was a direct threat to them. If they hadn't been vigilant, they would have ended up in an extremely ugly state. Sensing the cold gazes of the 2, Feng Xiang and the other genius of the Tianyang bloodline all had indifferent expressions, as if they didn't care about how the 2 of them would react. Feng Xiang once again spoke with a faint smile. "What? Could it be that your Cloud Sky bloodline wants to directly attack here? If that's the case, then my Tianyang bloodline doesn't mind accompanying you to the end." At this point, Feng Xiang no longer used any words. He, or rather, the Tianyang bloodline, was clearly deliberately targeting his Cloud Sky bloodline and wanted to make a move against him. However, at this point, not to mention Bahong and Zhangyu, how could the spectators of the Cloud Sky bloodline at the foot of the giant mountain suppress the anger in their hearts? The Tianyang bloodline unabashedly attacked the geniuses of their Cloud Sky bloodline. It was obvious that they had ill intentions towards them. If they could still endure it this time, wouldn't they be admitting that their Cloud Sky bloodline was a soft persimmon? As a result, before Bahong and Zhangyu could speak, there were many firm shouts from the Cloud Sky bloodline's disciples. "Tianyang bloodline, if you want to fight, then let's fight." Following the orderly shouts of the Cloud Sky bloodline's disciples, the atmosphere between them and the Tianyang bloodline had completely formed. However, at this moment, the two bloodlines were facing each other. No matter how one looked at it, the Cloud Sky bloodline was the weaker one. After all, just in the Tianyang bloodline's camp, there were a total of 7 commanders of the Tianfujing 7th floor. At this moment, no other faction could compare to this number of top-notch geniuses. Not to mention, beside the Tianyang's faction was the Kongtong faction's faction. Both sides were already on the same side. So if they really fought, how could they remain indifferent? Hence, Bahong and the rest, who were clearly aware of this, immediately turned their gazes towards the surrounding groups of disciples from the other factions. In the current situation, it could be said that the Tianyang bloodline was the only one in power. Therefore, as long as one had some brains, they wouldn't be able to watch the Tianyang bloodline be so arrogant. However, even though the situation was like this, standing out was directly opposing the Tianyang bloodline. Therefore, even if it was a group of disciples from the other factions, how could they easily stand out? After all, if he failed, it would mean that he would be eliminated. Thus, even the profound spirit faction, which had cooperated with the Cloud Sky faction before, didn't immediately step forward. This made Bahong and the others furious, but there was nothing they could do. Similarly, when they saw this scene, the commanders of the Tianyang bloodline couldn't help but coldly laugh. However, just at this moment, 2 beautiful figures suddenly walked out in front of the Cold Sky faction. The 2 beautiful figures were both born with peerless beauty, and their appearances were extremely similar. However, one of them was extremely mature and unapproachable, while the other was slightly immature. It wasn't that Yan Chutian didn't recognize these 2 people. Weren't they the Bai sisters, Bai Yanqing and Bai Zining, who had helped them force back the Tianyang disciples in the Crystal Marrow treasure land? When the Bai sisters stood out, the expressions of many of the Tianyang disciples changed. After all, if the lineage of Freezing Sky and the lineage of Cloud Sky walked together at that moment, then the situation would become incredibly strange. Within the Tianyang bloodline, especially Jiang Shao and Xin Yao, Yao Yao's expressions were extremely ugly. At this moment, Yao Yao's expression was extremely ugly. However, they still didn't understand. Back then, the Bai sisters should have fought for the Crystal Marrow, but now they didn't need to do so to obtain the Crystal Marrow they wanted. Could it be that they still had to fight because of this? Bai sisters, don't tell me you still want to stand with the Cloud Sky faction and fight against the Tianyang bloodline today? It was difficult to understand. Yao couldn't help but shout. However, Bai Zining didn't respond to his shout. Instead, Bai Yanqing's expression was indifferent as she calmly opened her red lips and said, "So what? Today, on the floating mountain, the Tianyang bloodline isn't the only one who can cover the sky with one hand." Bai Yanqing's words completely revealed the intentions of the Cold Sky faction. Perhaps if the other commanders of the Tianyang bloodline spoke like this, it wouldn't be convincing enough. However, since the target was one of the Bai sisters, no one would doubt it. The Bai sisters had the backing of the Bai family. Even the gold tablet or jade tablet disciples had to give them some face. The silver tablet disciples were even more respectful towards them. That was why it wasn't an exaggeration to say that the 2 of them could completely replace the intentions of the Cold Sky faction. That was why Bai Yanqing's words were the same as announcing that the Cold Sky faction was already standing on the same side as the Cloud Sky faction. While the disciples of the Cloud Sky bloodline were shocked by this, a look of joy quickly appeared on their faces. Because if they had the help of the Cold Sky faction, then even if the Tianyang bloodline and the Kong Tong bloodline worked together, they wouldn't be able to easily suppress them. However, there were also quite a few gazes that looked towards Yen Chutian, who was standing beside a certain beautiful figure. Because among the Cloud Sky faction disciples, some of them knew that the Bai sisters had stood on the side of the Cloud Sky faction that day. At that time, the Bai sisters had already treated Yen indifferently. That was why, when the Cold Sky faction stood on their side once again, how could they not let their imaginations run wild? When he sensed the gazes around him, Yen Chutian was speechless. But this time, he wasn't going to be at a loss. The Bai sisters definitely didn't have any ambiguous thoughts towards him. Thus, there was only one possibility. The Cold Sky faction truly didn't want to see the Tianyang bloodline continue to dominate. In truth, when he thought about it, it was simple. Even if the Tianyang bloodline could get along with the other bloodlines after eliminating the Cloud Sky faction, they would definitely take the majority of the crystal marrow in the floating mountain without hesitation. How much difference would there be between making a move at that time and making a move right now? With the Bai sisters' strength and status, how could they not have thought of this? In fact, even all the commander prodigies should know this clearly. However, some of them knew but remained silent. Some of them were afraid of the situation and pretended not to know. In conclusion, when the Cold Sky faction took the initiative to stand on the side of the Cloud Sky faction, it caused the originally one-sided situation to instantly return to a stalemate. Even if everything else was ignored, at the very least, the combined strength of the Cloud Sky faction and the Cold Sky faction was almost on par with the combined strength of the Tianyang and the Kong Tong faction. With the Cloud Sky faction and the Cold Sky faction added together, there were a total of 4 teams and 9 commander prodigies. They only had 1 less commander prodigy compared to the Tianyang and Kong Tong factions. However, even though they had 1 less commander prodigy, they still had an advantage in terms of number of disciples. After all, the Tianyang and Kong Tong factions only had 3 teams of disciples. Thus, in this situation, even the commander prodigies of the Tianyang bloodline, who had been acting extremely domineering and arrogant, had their expressions changed slightly. They no longer had the disdain they had before. The fact that the Cold Sky faction stood out at this moment was something they had not expected. Originally, they had thought that even if the other factions would work together to fight for the spirit crystals, they would only do so after the Cloud Sky faction was eliminated. After all, no matter how many crystal essences there were in the floating mountain, they should not want to have one more faction to share. Or else, no matter how large their share of the crystal essences was, the number of crystal essences would decrease. However, no matter how well they had thought, no one would have thought that the Cold Sky faction would stand out at this moment. And because they had stood out, the situation had become extremely bad. If they truly fought, even if they could win, they would have to pay a great price. In fact, even whether they could win or not was risky. However, they had already said those arrogant and domineering words just now. How could they take them back? If they retreated now, it would mean that the Tianyang bloodline was afraid. Chapter 8:25. The 6 factions were gathered at the center of the floating mountain range. Although the marrow beast within the collapsed mountain had already been annihilated by the combined efforts of everyone, the tense atmosphere did not dissipate. Instead, it grew increasingly intense. The opposing faction could be said to be the strongest faction in the inner sect of the Firmament God Palace. However, due to the special circumstances of the floating mountain, the Tianyang faction could not be underestimated even though they were the strongest faction. Because at that moment, the Cloud Sky faction had already joined forces with the Freezing Sky faction. With the 4 squads from the 2 factions added together, the overall power they possessed was equivalent to the combined power of the Heavenly Sun faction and the Kongtong faction. Thus, even the commanders and prodigies from the Tianyang faction felt as if they could not advance or retreat. After all, the Cloud Sky and Freezing Sky factions, added together, were not weak. If they truly fought with everything they had, even if they could win, the price they would have to pay would be too great. Not to mention, there were also the disciples of the Heaven Array sect and the Profound Spirit sect. Although these two sects did not seem to have any intention of interfering, who could guarantee that if the two sides fought to the point where both sides were injured, the other side would not suddenly sit back and reap the benefits? This was also the reason why the prodigies from the Tianyang faction were even more worried. After all, although they did not like the Cloud Sky faction and wanted nothing more than to stomp them to death, all of this was built on the premise that they did not harm their own interests. If they hurt the enemy while losing 800 of their own, they would not be able to obtain any benefits. Who would be willing to do such a thing? Thus, as they hesitated, the gazes of the many prodigies from the Tianyang faction quickly turned towards the disciples from the Heaven Array and Profound Spirit factions. Although these two factions were troublesome third parties, if they could pull them into their faction, they would not only be third parties, they would also become a considerable power. If they could pull the two factions into their faction, then even if the Cloud Sky faction and Freezing Sky faction worked together, they would not be a problem. However, when the Tianyang faction's prides looked over, the two leaders of the Heaven Array faction and the leader of the Profound Spirit faction seemed to have expected this. They decisively said, "Ha! Today we have formed our own faction. Therefore, we will not join any faction. Don't worry, if the two of you fight, we will definitely not interfere." The words of the two supreme leaders were equivalent to directly sealing off all cooperation. After all, they knew that the so-called cooperation at this time was not reliable. Even if he won, he probably wouldn't get much of the benefits. Rather than that, it was naturally better to remain neutral. Although Tianyang's prodigies were very displeased with how crafty the Tianjin and Xianling factions were. But no matter how unhappy they were, they would not show it. Otherwise, if the two factions were to be forced towards each other because of this, wouldn't it instead cause the situation on his side to become extremely bad? It was just that the situation had returned to the situation at the beginning, back to the situation of not being able to make a move. However, the stalemate would eventually be broken. No matter how rigid the situation was, it would eventually be broken. Moreover, the supreme leader of the Tianyang faction also thought that if the hard way did not work, he would use the soft way. As long as the other factions were separated, the Tianyang faction would still be the strongest faction. Even if they could not directly eliminate the Cloud Sky faction's disciples, they could still indirectly suppress them. Therefore, within the Tianyang faction, Shen Wuling directly took a step forward and said to the other two factions, "Everyone, now is not the final moment of the Sky Desert world. Therefore, there is no need for us to fight to the death." Shen Wuling's words not only made the Cloud Sky faction's disciples, but also the Kongtong faction's disciples, who wore the same pants as them, curled their lips. After all, it was clearly the Tianyang faction's disciples who were the most arrogant and instigated the conflict. At this moment, seeing that the situation was not good, they were truly shameless to say such words. However, even so, everyone did not directly refute and only responded with silence. However, in many cases, silence was equivalent to tacit agreement. Therefore, Shen Wuling immediately continued, "The reason we are gathered here is none other than the crystal marrow hidden in this mountain. In that case, it's simple. We will pick some disciples from each faction. Based on the outcome of the battle between them, we will distribute the crystal marrow each faction can get." Shen Wuling's intention was to limit the large-scale battle between the factions to a small, controllable range. One had to admit that this was not only a situation that the Tianyang faction was happy to see, but also a situation that the other factions would rather see. This way, not only would they be able to fairly distribute the crystal marrow opportunity, but it would also not cause any faction to lose too much. Therefore, not long after Shen Wuling finished speaking, all the factions nodded in agreement. Seeing this, The smile on Shun Wuling's face became even wider, and he continued, "Since all the factions have agreed, we can now explain the general rules. First of all, the Tianyang faction will not take advantage of the other factions. We will pick 10 disciples from each faction from the Tianfujing 6th floor. Based on the outcome of the 10 disciples from each faction, the number of crystal marrow opportunities will be determined." Shun Wuling's previous words made the Tianyang faction's disciples unable to find any fault with them. However, the final restriction of the rules suddenly made some disciples, as well as Shun Wuling. The expressions of Yao and Jiang Shao changed slightly. This was because they could not help but recall the battle in the Crystal Marrow treasured land that day. At that time, she and Shun Wuling had been together. Yao had also used this method to determine the outcome of the battle between the two factions. However, it was this method of battle that they thought they had a 90% chance of winning in the end. And the main reason was that strange disciple from the Cloud Sky faction. Clearly, his cultivation was only at the Tianfujing 4th floor, but his cultivation was comparable to the 5th level of the Tianfujing realm. He had even defeated one of the disciples with extraordinary strength under his command. Therefore, when they heard the similar rules at this moment, how could they remain calm? This was especially so when they saw that Yan Chutian's cultivation seemed to have stepped into the 5th level of the Tianfujing realm. This made their expressions change even more. However, after thinking about it for a moment, they ultimately did not think that Lin Fan had stepped into the 5th level of the Tianfujing realm, would be able to inherit the ability to fight against those above his level and compete with the Tianfujing 6th floor cultivators. Moreover, the Tianyang faction would have a greater advantage if they had a disciple with a higher cultivation. Therefore, such a situation should be more advantageous for them. With this thought in mind, the two of them, as well as the other disciples, gradually calmed down. At the same time, Shun Wuling, who was completely unaware of this, continued to speak about the so-called rules. The rules he spoke of sounded very fair, and no one could find fault with them. Therefore, the various factions quickly began to pick out 10 disciples from the Tianfujing 6th floor. At this moment, many disciples of the Cloud Sky bloodline subconsciously turned their gazes to Yan Chuan. Although the latter looked like he had just stepped into the 5th level of the Tianfujing realm not long ago, everyone knew that his strength could not be measured by his superficial strength. Therefore, they were naturally curious. Would he stand out and take one of the spots at this time? Yan Chutian did not show any signs of cowardice despite being stared at by so many people. He did not know the strength of the others, but he was quite confident in his own strength. Therefore, he could not retreat at this time and immediately walked out of the crowd step by step. Of course, my Hani, who was beside him, did not show any signs of weakness. As she walked lightly, an enormous pressure spread out from her delicate body. It was enough to cause all the surrounding disciples to subconsciously take a step back. My Hani did not need to be said. Back then, she had killed a disciple from the Tianfujing 6th floor of the Kongtong faction. Therefore, even if her cultivation was not at the peak of the Tianfujing 6th floor, she had undoubtedly obtained a spot. As for Yan Chutan, perhaps he would cause some disputes among the disciples. However, with the series of previous performances, even if there were disciples who opposed him, their voices were very soft and did not dare to be loud. However, not everyone was like that. Soon, a figure walked out from the crowd and looked at Yan Chutian with a condescending gaze. He did not conceal his disdain as he said, "This kind of occasion isn't a place where any random person can step up. Not to mention, it's just a lucky bastard who managed to accumulate some so-called fame. P.S. The next chapter will be delayed indefinitely because the results are very bad, so it will be ending directly. Now, Blue Sky is preparing a new book. If fate wills it, I hope we will meet again in the new book." Chapter 8:26. The tumultuous hustle and bustle finally calmed down. The youth in the haze suddenly raised his gaze, but what he really saw was only the 4 stone walls, and in this stone room, there was a seemingly eternal spiritual light. Yan Chutian raised his gaze still looking around blankly. Gradually, a clear light slowly emerged in his line of sight. His mind was filled with thoughts. He remembered that he had died in the hands of the ghost venerables. He remembered that he had been reborn in the mortal world, and then rose all the way back to the heaven realm. Yen Chutian didn't expect that the effect of this Tao sculpting heavenly spirit fruit would be so miraculous. It could actually let people experience an almost rebirth experience. And this experience had given him a great harvest, and he was not far from a breakthrough. However, when he recalled that extremely realistic experience and realized that it was actually a fabrication, he sighed in his heart. However, Yen Chutian understood that this was the way of the great Tao. Moreover, there was a more important reality for him now. The end of the book.